Today in Historic Medicine, we're going to discuss some of the diseases afflicting people in the summertime. Many of these diseases are quite deadly, and this is what a physician is up against, even in New York Colony, New York State at that time. The first being malaria, the second dysentery. These were actually two of the biggest killers of people in colonial America. It's not smallpox and it's not battle wounds, it's actually malaria and dysentery. Probably the most deadliest disease of mankind is malaria. It's killed more people throughout the ages than any other disease that is known to man. It's still with us today. In the 18th century, they knew nothing of germs and bacteria or any type of parasite, which basically came about at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So for a physician in the 18th century to treat malaria, they had to rely on some imported products and a lot of guessing. Malaria itself would start with chills and work into fits and seizures, and unquenchable shaking that the patient would have. What they would do is first actually bleed the patient. And on our table we have some examples of a bleeding cup and fleams and lancets that would be used to raise a vein and open it up to bleed. The reasoning being is thinking of getting the illness out of the body. Secondly, they would treat the fever and the shakes that come with malaria, and that would commonly be done with something imported from Peru, Honduras, basically tropical rainforests, not something that's available here in New York. It's called cinchona. It is a bark from a tree. Some people know it as Peruvian bark or Jesuit's bark. Inside that bark, when it's dried, there's an alkali that can be extracted, and that is quinine. And I think we're all familiar with quinine in the treatment of malaria. Quinine will come in, be pulverized and then suspended in tincture of white wine, or it can be used as a tea or any alcohol for that matter, and delivered to the patient. This would generally treat the symptoms of the disease itself while not necessarily curing it. It's amazing that until the late 1920s, when oxyhydrochloroquine, which you hear a lot about these days, was developed and utilized through the 1950s to treat malaria around the world, it really didn't do the job. Malaria became resistant to oxyhydrochloroquine, and they're back to using quinine. Now, although we have eradicated the mosquito in North America that carries this disease, it is still in Central Africa today, so there are people suffering with malaria. In the 18th century, they thought, and earlier, they thought that malaria came from bad air. Malaria, it's Latin for bad air. So if you had swamps or a dense pine wood that's very damp and dank and humid, the winds or breezes that would be brought upon the population was thought to cause the disease. Obviously we know it is mosquitoes, so they're in the right church but the wrong pew, so to speak. Perhaps the second most deadliest disease in colonial America is dysentery, or what they call the bloody flux. They call it the bloody flux because it is basically a diarrhea. It's very extreme, and there's a loss of blood and mucus involved in the stool. In the 18th century, some of the treatments for this would be to bleed the patient, very common, trying to get the illness out of the body through the blood. The second would be to treat it with something, and that is usually an opiate. The symptoms of dysentery are extreme stomach cramps, and then of course the bloody flux, the bloody stool, which continues. If unabated, within 3 to 7 days, the patient would perish, and most did. It is not something you either wrote it out or you died of it. So they attempted to treat it, again, by bleeding first, and secondly, administering perhaps the salt of lead or lead acetate, and also an emetic or something to make the patient vomit what they thought was causing the illness. And they would use basically a syrup of Ipecac to do that. I'm sure many of you remember as a child having Ipecac to get something out of your system. But they would use an opiate to treat the pain. And opium comes in a variety of forms. Again, it comes from a poppy in the Far East, at this time period, China. A lot of people who do Civil War medicine are familiar with blue mass pills. Well, blue mass pills have been around for quite a while. That's a combination of mercury and opium. You can imagine quite a toxic substance to be giving a patient. But basically, the biggest one that's used is laudanum. And laudanum is opium suspended in white wine. And it would be used in a certain amount of drops over a certain period of time based on the person's body weight. This would at least get rid of the pain that the person is going through. But it's not treating the malady. We know today that that comes from a parasite or from poor hygiene and basically not washing your hands after you've gone to the restroom. Handling food, handling drink that people consume. So it is very contagious. In the 18th century, you can imagine where hygiene standards may not be as good as they are today, where we wash our hands with soap on a regular basis. One of the more common ways for someone to contract dysentery is through tainted water, be it a late summer well that's gone fetid, drinking from streams and ponds where feces have gone through, or where there's the amoebic dysentery, where there is an actual organism that will enter your body and create the dysentery. Many people are probably familiar with the term Giardia or beaver fever. If you're a camper and such, and you drink from a water source that's not been boiled or purified, you run that risk of that type of contamination. It's a cousin of dysentery. Today we treat it with antibiotics. Again, in the 18th century, they're not doing much to actually treat the disease. They're trying to treat the symptoms of the disease and put the person at rest. So your body would actually have to fight it out. More often than not, people did not survive. It was common in the military, so much so that most of the writings that we have on dysentery comes from surgeons and surgeons' mates from the Army and the Navy to a certain degree during that period. So again, this is just a brief overview of two of the largest killer summer diseases of the 18th century. We're looking forward to having more discussions on various diseases and ailments in the 18th and early 19th century coming up in our future videos. I hope you enjoyed this, found it interesting, and if you do, please see us at Historic Medicine on Facebook, and watch for us on YouTube for more videos. Thank you.